yawning. I found no distinction. I really haven't. But this gap is yawning. It's gaping. And it's having the effect of pulling us apart. But this gap is yawning. It's gaping.
Angry protesters at the doorsteps of Honduras's presidential palace want President Manuel Zelaya back. The army took over the palace and sealed the entrances, their weapons at the ready. Wielding sticks and steel batons, Zelaya's supporters tried to push themselves through the gate, now guarded by troops in riot gear. Columns of smoke from tires set alight blocked the street outside the palace. It all began at dawn on Sunday when some 200 soldiers surrounded the president's private home. They took him at gunpoint and flew him out of the country to neighboring Costa Rica. A local journalist here could not hide her frustration.
For the first time we had a president, a great president who was defending the poor, and simply because he was defending our cause, he was kidnapped this morning, and I weep these tears of indignation.
After arriving in Costa Rica, Zelaya told his supporters they should protest in peace, while insisting he remained the rightful president of Honduras.
I asked them to keep calm, but at the same time to defend the rights of society. If we ourselves cannot defend the rights of society, I call for a peaceful resistance without violence. I ask them to seek civil disobedience in a nonviolent way so that they demand the usurpers respect Honduras' democracy.
Late in the day, the Honduran Supreme Court issued a statement saying it ordered the army to oust Zelaya for trying to hold what it said was an unlawful referendum to change the constitution. An independent candidate in November's presidential election said many powers conspired to oust Zelaya. The protesters called him a traitor. At the Congress chamber, congressional leader Roberto Micheletti, a member of Zelaya's own party, was sworn in as interim president until the November elections. Members of Congress said they'd received a letter of resignation from Zelaya, a suggestion that the ousted president dismissed as a lie. In his first move as acting president,
Greetings, salutations, welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We are broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic in the Digitosphere. On this week's program, Vanessa A.B., contributing editor and writer for Current Affairs, on a recent visit to France, family tradition, and the context and appropriate understanding of the Yellow Vests uprising. Plus, Valeska Martins. She is co-counsel for political prisoner and former Brazilian president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. We have an exclusive interview with her, very few interviews with her in the English language press. We've discussed lawfare, the role of the Department of Justice, U.S. foreign policy, and the attempted destruction and privatization of Petrobras, and how it all fits in to the prosecution of the successful president Lula and the broader crisis in Brazil, and what we can do to help. An exclusive interview on the Michael Brooks Show. Plus, we have a shout out to a radical new climate action group fighting against the extinction of our planet and species. David Griscom is hitting us with an economic minute, as he is one to do. And then we go to the post game, where we've got a throwback to Noam Chomsky talking about linguistics and prestige, Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn pushing for a no-confidence vote as the military is at the ready. Theresa May continues to flounder the shambolic but always cruel Tories' power forward. Plus, Mark Lamont Hill, Russell Brand versus sociopath Candace Owens, and the ever dubious Dave Rubin with a new dodgy imam. All that on the postgame.
Dave Rubin talking to a Muslim.
Dave
I
Rubin
can't wait.
it's going to be fascinating. I'm sure it's a highly credentialed and respected intellectual and member of the faith.
I wonder what sort of things they're going to agree about.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I wonder if Jesus' good treatment of Muslims will be mentioned. But first, we have to talk about the migrant caravan. U.S. troops are still at the border. A vicious, barbarous U.S. immigration system, which has been formed in modern politics by, among other administrations, both of Trump's predecessors, Bush and Obama. ICE was created in the Bush administration, codified and accelerated with all of its accoutrements of private consulting and security firms under the Obama administration, and of course, expanded dramatically in terms of its purpose and strategy of essentially ethnic cleansing America in the Trump era. The caravan, which has been the site of enormous racism and fear-mongering, is actually also a tremendous site of not only solidarity and concern, but actually learning and hope for the rest of us attempting to practice a truly emancipatory politics. But first, we're going to play a brief clip of this report from TRT TV, a Turkish global broadcaster, on the migrant situation. We're going to play a brief clip of this.
Imagine how far someone has to be pushed to take this sort of risk.
He's trying to get into the United States the only way he can. But he and the baby never had a chance. U.S. border agents were more than ready for them and immediately detained them for crossing the border illegally. Many of the migrants from Central America don't seem to be afraid of detention. For them, all that matters is they've made it to America.
Our lives are in danger in Honduras because of problems between family members. Our lives are at risk, and that is why we decided to leave, to risk crossing to the other side.
The current situation of the caravan stands as this. Around 3,000 migrants, half of the migrants have entered the U.S. and are now being held in detention. The rest are waiting to enter from Tijuana. The U.S. has met the caravan with force using tear gas against migrants at the border. It was revealed that U.S. Border Patrol agents have been pouring out water left near the border for migrants by human rights groups. 7-year-old Jacqueline M.A. Rosemary Cal Macuan died in U.S. custody after her illness and weak state were ignored by U.S. authorities. She died, and this administration and those agencies are responsible for the death of a 7-year-old girl. Conversely, the caravan is actually an enormous site of political imagination. The caravan has shown what democracy in action might actually look like. It's created a comprehensive form of democracy. Important decisions are made by a General Assembly, a 9-person elected governance and dialogue council. It's charged with advocating for the needs of the caravan with human rights groups and governments. And as we talk about class politics in the United States, we need to talk about class politics across the entire hemisphere. They are inseparable. That's fundamental to the mission of this show. The migrant caravan is an inspirational form of class solidarity, autonomy, and action, and it should serve as an inspiration in our own struggles against the oligarchic order. Now, we know that the context of this crisis is both the machinery of the bureaucracy of abuse of migrants. Check out the unlocked illicit history that I did with attorney Stephen Robbins on how these institutions work. Essential listening. There's also a geopolitical context, a drug war that the United States fuels across the region. A massive amount of artillery, militarization, and violence attended to that war, and generations of U.S. coups, U.S.-backed death squads, mass murder, as well as a prison industrial complex expansion and gang activity here that was re-exported back into Central and Latin America. Of particular importance is the 2009 coup that deposed Manuel Zelaya, a center-left progressive Honduran leader who was elected in 2006. This coup was conducted by the military and strongly supported by the Clinton State Department and shored up by the United States government. Lonnie Davis, a close Hillary Clinton associate, was a lobbyist, if I recall at the time, on behalf of the coup regime. President Zelaya ran as a moderate and was part of a traditional political party, the Liberal Party, and came from great wealth. However, he shifted steadily to the center-left as part of a broader pink tide realignment. He invested in services for the poor. He worked towards protecting the environment. He was working his way towards being in the sort of center of that axis, probably closer to a Lula, but also reaching out certainly to Hugo Chavez, because as we should remember, all of those pink tide governments, even though they had radically different politics, were aligned in terms of wanting autonomy, respect, and dealing with inequality, oligarchy, and independence. The Honduran military took Zelaya, exiled him to Costa Rica. Zelaya returned and was given refuge for 3 months in the Brazilian embassy in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa. And that the reason he sought and got that refuge was because of a guy who was president of Brazil at the time, President Lula da Silva, backed Zelaya, gave him refuge, and worked in regional blocs to fight against the Honduran coup regime. After the military junta captured Zelaya and after the exile, the coup situation has deteriorated dramatically. Police and landlords who kill workers regularly who protest the regime. Prominent environmental activists have been murdered. There have been specifically of worth mentioning is Berta Cáceres, an indigenous environmental activist who singled out the role of Hillary Clinton and Obama administration's role in legitimizing the coup that pulled out the democratically elected Zelaya from power. She was assassinated by paramilitaries connected to the logging industry. There's no left nationalism. There's no left exclusion. We have to think in a global synchronized way. It's both our ethical commitment and it's also the reality of a globalized economy. We can't just retool liberal opinion on immigration. They need to provide radically new and different alternatives of policy, organizing, and solidarity. Supporting this caravan provides the left with an opportunity to concretely link the struggle we face globally, from imperialism to capitalism, from climate change to the hurdles that the migrants caravan have already faced and overcome. And that can serve as an example of what mobilization can actually accomplish. The migrant caravan was born out of necessity, but it has shown what determination, solidarity, and hope can accomplish, and what we must accomplish if we are able to escape the suffocating embrace of capitalism and move to a humane, successful post-capitalist future. That we'll definitely do more coverage on Honduras. That coup is a huge that was the beginning of this sort of reverse domino effect and this new iteration of U.S. undermining and reassertion of traditional military, corporate, and oligarchies in Latin America. It's a very important example. And I remember I covered the assassination of Berta, and she was extraordinarily brave, incredibly effective activist. She was murdered in her home. And I remember, and she certainly called out Hillary Clinton's role, and I remember this was during the spring of 2016, so I remember saying, I'm with her. That is the her I'm with. And she, along with, Marielle Franco and other martyrs of this modern moment. So, any thoughts, guys? Anything you guys want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, this caravan has just been so inspiring. Not only have we seen just like the way that people are organizing, but democratically amongst all of these different people from different backgrounds. This is a movement that's gone across different countries, crosses across ethnic and racial lines, and it's the kind of solidarity and political movement that we definitely need to see. Not only that, but its fearlessness in facing the American government, even like a militarized border, and crossing it anyway is the kind of determination and the actual kind of political action that we really need to start seeing being articulated more on the left. And it's something I think that especially the American left and the workers' movement needs to take a lot more seriously, because when we're talking about questions of immigration, though the center of exploitation is the same people who exploit workers domestically in the United States, right? Like, these are people who have vast amounts of power and are looking for people to abuse and that they can extract value from. And to have American workers, disregard these migrants, I think is a real shame and a real failure of organizing on our part. Because when we see this migrant caravan, we should see our brothers and sisters, and we should welcome them with open arms and learn from them and their incredible movement that they've already gone so far and have done so much to show what is possible.
Yeah, it makes me remember all the takes of, this is going to be the last you're going to hear of the caravan after the midterms, right?
Right.
And I think, more or less, this is going to be the main archetypal story of the next, 30 years, is these sorts of issues. It's not going anywhere.
Because their imagination only allowed for, this will be the last you'll hear of the racist fear-mongering that the Republicans are going to do before the election cycle, right? And so Trump won't tweet about it as much. But the story and what it exemplifies is the time we're in.
Yeah, and what's causing it, exactly.
Right. Yes, exactly. All right, let's go to the shout-outs. Oh, man, you don't have my Alex Jones ready?
Shout out. Creepy. Shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy.
I wish he was on our side.
Shout out. This is crazy.
How great would it be if Alex Jones...
This is out of control.
This is out of control.
That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy.
Reading Bhaskar Sunkar's new book, and folks, I gotta tell you, he just stills it every which way. He's explaining.
It's gaping.
So that horrifying new drop is of the senator from the credit card industry and former Vice President Joe Biden. Thanks, Matt. Shout out goes. Oh, jeez. Fuck, dude. Come on. There is no, I don't mean this like in a bad way, but there's no justifiable context for that. It's just God.
But this gap is yawning. It's gaping.
He's talking about inequality. That's a teaser for what we get to in the postgame.
Yeah. Well, he's right so far. That's how Thomas Piketty described it. The Climate Extinction Project is a radical climate action group that has done, I'm quoting briefly from The Intercept, in London, less than a month after Extinction Rebellion activists blocked roads and occupied buildings, laid down on the street, got arrested to draw immediate attention to climate crisis, Mayor Sadiq Khan declared climate emergency, vowing to do everything in our power to mitigate the risks of climate catastrophe. Coincidence? Greg Shedwalk doesn't think so. And he goes on to explain what they've done in terms of direct action. This is a video announcing their launch, and obviously this is incredible, robust, powerful organizing, very in line with our friend Joshua Kahn and his work at Wildfire Project and climate action work.
We all think of it as something big that's looming in the future, that there's things that as humans, that when we get to it, we'll be able to cope with it when and if it happens, whereas the reality is we're sleepwalking into a catastrophe.
We are organising a rebellion
against the UK government
for their criminal inaction
on mass species extinction
and climate breakdown.
This means civil disobedience
and peaceful law breaking
with 3 key demands.
To declare a climate emergency,
to communicate the crisis with the public,
to go zero carbon by 2025. We are calling for the creation
of a National Assembly
to vote on our way out of the crisis.
Ordinary people making informed decisions
about our future
through a system known as sortition.
The time for hope is over.
We need courage.
We are acting because it's the right thing to do.
Help us to organise a talk and direct action training in your area.
Join us for a declaration of rebellion in London on the 31st of October
and November the 17th
in Parliament Square.
We are so very nearly
out of time.
Help us
to do what is right.
And they're here in New York as but one example as they work to deploy in the United States. The New York chapter, I'm quoting back now from The Intercept. The New York chapter of Extinction Rebellion held its first planning meeting on Thursday. Incensed and terrified by the accelerating climate crisis, activists gathered in Manhattan to discuss how they might replicate some of the successes that the Direct Action Group has had in the United Kingdom. In London, and then it goes on to outline what I had said before. But this is incredibly important. It harkens back actually to some of the direct action work that AIDS and HIV/AIDS activists did against the criminal negligence of the Reagan and Bush senior administrations. And it is necessary not only to, of course, in the crisis sense, avert the horrifying prospects of what already exists in terms of massive climate change, of species extinction, of environmental refugees and global climate devastation from oceans to rainforests to fisheries to our air. But it also harkens a possibility of a radically redesigned economy and political system which delivers equality, justice, and well-being for all, and of course coalesces with the amazing work that AOC and others are doing on putting a Green New Deal at the center of the agenda. All right, so check it out. Okay, we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we do here, our live show, and then we're going to get to our friend Vanessa A.B. to talk to her about her piece in Current Affairs. We are growing well. As of I checked before the show, we're at 1,804. So we're starting to circle and see into the horizon that 2000 goal, it helps us sustain what we do, and to think, to create, to plan, and to really across the board, whether it's highlighting solutions, ideas, and people that are doing incredible things and building out from this amazing community we have around us on the Discord and in other places, but also to build those global peer-to-peer linkages like we're doing tonight when we speak with Valeska Martins about the Lula case, drawing those global connections, being hopefully really like a prototype or enacting that kind of real-world solidarity. And then, of course, we have a lot of fun. I don't know if you guys, I hope you have fun, but we fuck around a lot and have a lot of fun. And by this time, if you become a patron, there are, I think, over 100 additional episodes, including primers and post games. I was thinking of one the other day, a piece that I'm doing. It's going to come out soon with Jean Bajlan and the Jacobin about the Kurdish political leaders that are political prisoners in the Erdogan government. And we'll be covering that more as well in this show. But we did a primer on the HDP back in the beginning of the show, an incredible Kurdish Social Democratic Party, which has been suppressed and crushed by the Erdogan regime. Histories of Iran, introductions to CLR James, how apartheid actually collapsed. Mark Blythe on our economic system, Richard Wolff in the post games, Matt Taibbi. I mean, we have an incredible community around us. In the early new year, we're going to bring to you people like the British-Nigerian author Ralph Leonard, brilliant Marxist critic, and has a left critique of of cultural politics, but one that in the CLR James tradition brings us forward instead of regressing us. We're coming back to Mike Hanna. I mean, there's a lot here in terms of grasping and understanding the world, how it works, and how to best operate in it. And we're incredibly proud, and we want you to join us in doing just that. Patreon.com/TMBS, Patreon.com/TMBS. We're halfway sold out of tickets to our first live show. It's going to be at the Bell House, February 1st in Brooklyn, New York. We hope to see you there. There's going to be special guests, regular crew, Bhaskar Sunkara, Alona Minkowski, Trevor Bellew, all brilliant, great people that you all know, of course, from the show and from their great individual works. As Alona is a great host, Bhaskar from Jacobin, and his new book is coming out soon. And, of course, T hosts the excellent Champagne Sharks podcast, which everybody should check out as well. And there might even be a special sketch that the very funny Mike Racine and I are working on. There's going to be an impression contest. There's going to be a lot going on. Get your tickets so we can see you at the Bell House. All right, thanks everybody. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Vanessa A.B. on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Vanessa A.B. She's a current contributing editor at Current Affairs. Vanessa, thanks so much for rejoining us on the Michael Brooks Show.
Hi, Michael.
Vanessa, you were in France on family business, actually, when the Yellow Vests protests and movement broke out. Can you talk to us about your relationship to France as a country? What had you going back home? You write very well in this essay, home for the Gilets Jaunes days, and I'm sure you'll pronounce it correctly in a second. You talked about going home to see your grandparents and then these demonstrations breaking out, and you wove these themes together. So can you talk about, just what's your relationship to France and what brought you back there?
Yeah, so for anyone who might be familiar with my face, I'm a Black woman. I was actually born in Cameroon, but I was adopted by French parents as a baby. So I'm a French citizen. And American now, but French is my first language. I grew up, my hometown is about 3 hours southwest of Paris. It's called Châtellerault. It's very close to, the Castle region, the wine region, the cow region. And I also lived in Lyon for 5 years, which is in the southeast of France, closer to Switzerland and Germany. And so my mom and I moved to the United States in 2002, but my dad, my grandparents, my godparents, my stepmom, all still live in France, and so I make it a point to go back every year and, to see my family, but also stay connected to that part of my culture.
How would you describe French politics right now in terms of the context that leads to these protests? Obviously, we've spent a good amount of time on this show exposing the Macron catastrophe. There's the Mélenchon sort of potential. There's a Le Pen threat. There's a total collapse of the Socialist Party. And I feel like in the United States, it kind of gets filtered in three ways. There's sort of like the old U.S. story, which is like, France is great and it would be an amazing place to live and everybody's relaxed and they have the best food and it's awesome, but it's totally unsustainable. And pretty soon they need to figure out how to destroy their labor unions and destroy their quality of life, just like us. And then there's like, France is tremendously xenophobic. There's huge race and religious, issues and hierarchies. And now, of course, with Macron, France is like the citadel of the resistance. So what is France's political moment? Like what is the context that leads to the Yellow Vests?
Yeah, so it's interesting because France has, even though it has this powerful neo-fascist party, the Front National, it has resisted Jean-Marie Le Pen and his daughter Marine Le Pen, and actually now there's a niece, I think her name is Marion Le Pen, who is taking the mantle from her aunt to kind of try to rebrand these fascist politics as more palatable. And the French didn't go for it in 2017. And so it's not so much, there's this impression that it's not so much that the French voted for Macron so much as they voted against Le Pen, because that was still too far right for the majority of the population. And so at this point, France is ruled by, a centrist who has he's very well off in his background. He used to be an investment banker before becoming Minister of the Economy. And he is from the upper class, and he has, gotten his feet in hot water, as a result of some of the offhand comments that he has made regarding lower class French people, and just comments really demonstrating his lack of understanding of what it's like to live paycheck by paycheck. And I want to clarify that France is, it has a more robust social welfare program. like a more robust social safety net. It is overall less unequal than the United States. That being said, there's still like there's a large degree of inequality between the 1% and between everyone else. I view the Gilets jaunes protest as a sort of rebellion of the middle class, and you can see it in the faces of the people showing up. It's like, it looks like it's a lot of the, you know, the mid-range middle class and then the lower middle class. So there are some business owners. It's a very, you know, I was struck by how white the protest was. And so when people talk about France being more equal than the United States, it's because there's this, you know, the top 80% of the country is, you know, I think better off than maybe the equivalent here in the United States. But then there's this whole bottom 20% that really, really struggles. Like, there is poverty in France. It's just maybe not as extent as it is here, but like, as a person who lived in government projects in France for about, you know, for like a couple of years, and who's like, my mom, you know, had close friends who were not poor at all, who were immigrants from Africa and from Arab countries. Like, I can guarantee you that there's an entire subclass of French people that do not make it into like the cute pamphlets about French, the Tour Eiffel, and like baguettes. Like, that's not the whole story. And it's one of the reasons why I live in the United States, frankly, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
right.
This is a pretty unequal country and a pretty racist country, and I still think I'm better off here as a woman of color than I would be there. So it's complicated.
Definitely. And I mean, and I want to tease that out in a second. But I mean, first of all, just why do you think it's so white and isn't sort of more kind of broad-based?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that part of the story is that, and I don't mean to whitewash the whole protest. There are definitely people of color there.
Right.
I think one factor might be that at least in the early weekends, so this has been going on for 4 or 5 weekends, where the yellow vests have been coming up to Paris on Saturdays to protest. And so people have been traveling from the regions to Paris. I think to be able to travel, you know, you have to have a car. Right. Maybe you have to have a job that doesn't require you to work on the weekends. I think there are factors that would make it so that sort of lower income Black people of African descent, just would be less likely to even be able to make the protests. But, you know, overall, when I was leaving, the Gilets jaunes were polling really high nationally. So even though only a very small fraction of French people are participating in these protests, the approval for the protesters was between 70 and 77%. So I don't doubt that number would encompass people of color that we're not necessarily seeing in the protests.
And also, this is like I want to give you a 2-part question. So like last week we opened the first segment of the show focused on these protests, and like the read that I had and that we put together was, this is a contested space basically. So, and it is organic. It is not directed by a particular political faction. And of course, like, the left is trying to capitalize. The fascists are trying to capitalize. The centrists are maybe not trying to capitalize. They're probably just trying to neutralize it. Their impulses about reinstating the wealth tax are correct. They want higher wages. They're correct. Even the objection to the petrol tax, I think, is largely correct, because it's taking it's putting a crisis of the environment that's generated, frankly, by capitalism or by the 1%, and putting it on the backs of people who actually have to like work and commute for a living. And so, and then at the same time, okay, there's like all these flashpoints that people have mentioned of like, you know, here's an expression of xenophobia at one of these protests, or, you know, these things are happening in like very autonomous, decentralized ways. So like, I guess my question, like, do you think that's the best way to look at it, and that from that perspective, the left could really make inroads to it? Or is it just, you know, too chaotic to even like project that on? Or is there like a solid base of like, no, fundamentally, the real fight here is on inequality, and obviously that's the type of thing that you could build a mass politics around?
I think the left could, and I think it's trying, but it's hard because the movement is so decentralized that it has been very resistant to being sort of co-opted by politicians and syndicates. And by syndicates, I mean these sort of large representative associations and unions, which France has just a multitude of. And so it's not for lack of trying. You know, in fact, the person who was my favorite candidate during the French election is the socialist called Benoît Hamon. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've been sort of following him lately, and he's been trying to build on the Yellow Vest protest to push a French version of the Green New Deal, right? Awesome. He's saying enough is enough. Like what we're seeing here is that you're passing on these costs to like small polluters, and you're letting big fish get away with basically, you know, murder by pollution. Yeah. And like, how about we use this opportunity to actually create not only like to fight global warming while creating jobs. Of course, it's polling very low. Who knows if it will, you know, get more traction. But I think there have been attempts. But again, it's hard because this particular protest is so decentralized. And even the demands that they have put out, you know, as I wrote in my essay, I was surprised by how progressive the demands were. Right. And I think that's because some lefties, you know, successfully got their set of demands in the hands of the government first, but that's not necessarily reflective of the views of the entire movement. And in fact, when polled, the movement really skews right. It has, you know, the Gilets jaunes includes a lot of people who voted for Le Pen or for the other conservative candidate, Fillon, in 2017. I mean, that tells us certainly that these voters, these particular yellow vests, are maybe more likely to be xenophobic, but it doesn't tell us much in terms of where they are with respect to economic programs, right? Because the French already, even the French conservatives are, you know, to the left of American conservatives, have a lot of expectations from their government, and you know, they pay taxes and expect to get a lot in return. So if they're the kind of lefties who, you know, if we were to compare them to maybe the American voters who voted for Trump, or who we could have seen vote for Bernie, you know, like they're not 100% to the right, I would say. Then sure, there's an opportunity there for the left, and I guess only time will tell how that will play out.
What about? Could you tell us? It was interesting because I was familiar a little bit with Harmon, like because I just from following the 2017 election, and I felt bad for him because he did seem like he was trying to reorient the French Socialist Party to at least like a genuine social democratic position, but because of Hollande and because of various failings that, you know, the French Socialist Party, like so many other center-left parties across Western Europe, just had exhausted itself. And even though he was coming through with a pretty strong platform, it just wasn't, you know, people weren't receptive. And there was the new fascist in town, or the new old fascist, and then, you know, Macron all of a sudden bringing like third way AOL politics to France, like 20 years after it was trendy, but France never had it, so I guess it was new. And then, you know, Mélenchon, who, I heard some things that I were question marks to me, but on the other hand, he, you know, I liked him because he represented a robust left. So what is your feeling about Harmon and Mélenchon as the two kind of prime left political personalities?
Well, I leaned more towards Hamon. You know, I thought Mélenchon was okay, but he's an old school lefty. I wish I was more familiar with how the different, you know, sub bands of ideologies break down. But Mélenchon was a bit too protectionist for me. That was my sense, and so I was drawn towards Hamon. But I think one thing that happened is that because neither pulled out of the race, I felt like they kind of split the votes and allowed other more bland candidates to basically get more of the overall vote than them, at least in the first round.
Right.
So I liked Hamon a lot, but I felt like he should have, if Mélenchon had the bigger slice of left voters, then Hamon should have dropped out, so that his followers would go to Mélenchon, and so the left could have a better shot.
Yeah, no doubt. The left, definitely, that's a theme. The left needs to get more strategic. As a final, I mean, people really got to read this essay. There's a really good, you're weaving a lot together here, so you'll have a better sense of this after you read the piece, or if you've already read the piece. But final question, how is your family there doing, and what do they think of the state of the protests and Macron's kind of, he's trying to triangulate a response to it. What do they think of all of this?
Yeah, so my dad is a centrist, and he voted for Macron. My dad and stepmom and grandparents actually all fall pretty squarely in the middle class, middle to lower middle class. They voted for Macron because they wanted, a change. Obviously, they were never going to vote for Le Pen, but they were hoping for someone who could, create, I don't know. They totally bought his rhetoric, creating jobs, and the unions are very powerful in France, and I think, unfortunately, my dad has no idea. He's never been to the United States, so he doesn't know what it looks like to live in a country with very weak unions.
Right. He doesn't know what it means when you actually let the oligarchs completely destroy them.
That's right. And Macron is, one of the things that is most right-wing about Macron is how kind of anti-labor he is. He thinks labor is just too powerful. My dad drank the Kool-Aid and is currently, has expressed great disappointment in Macron. He has been very frustrated by the sort of elitist comments that Macron has made, and just really being a tone-deaf person, So they're pretty disappointed. At the same time, France is
He is a deaf-tone person. Fuck that guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
He is, France is it's just like a striking nation that's just in its blood. So there are protests all the time. So I can't say that. It seems to me that my dad isn't necessarily viewing these protests as being any more transformative than what they see on a day-to-day basis. That was my impression. He just didn't seem to think it was a huge deal. But he empathized with, the complaints about the fuel tax and, what sort of evolved into more than just complaints about the fuel tax, right? So taxes on retiree pensions, things like that.
Do you think? Maybe then if that's the other thing that always comes out of every story about France, which is they just strike. So is that the less so is and this, let's just make it parochial, will be less of a global citizen than Vanessa AB. Is the most valuable thing that could come out of people in the United States following these protests is get on the streets. Striking and protesting really does something. And even a guy like Macron needed to do some pretty significant U-turns in the first week.
That's right. And he's introduced some concessions. I want to leave at least on this note. He's been a little bit responsive. I still think the concessions are half-baked, and I think, in fact, that he is setting himself up for more protests at the end of next year, unless he makes some of the concessions more permanent. So I don't know if you heard about this, but one thing that just tickles me is he got these bankers, the heads of these large French banks, to come to the Elysee, which, the French White House, and to commit to capping the bank fees that people usually have to pay for having insufficient funds to about 25 euros a month, or what comes up to about 300 euros a year. right? This idea that like people are complaining that they don't have enough purchasing power, and so we're going to do this just for 2019. And then he got the banks to pledge to not try to make up the shortfall in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But like, if you give people the taste of having two things, you give people the taste of having lower bank fees for a year. You can't just take it away.
Exactly.
If you're serious about it, you turn it into a law.
Right, no doubt.
People will rebel. The second thing is that, on average, the fees that people pay monthly are every year. It's like the average is about 296 euros, which is less than 300 euros. So you've introduced this cap, but like realistically, like on average, the banks will still basically make out as much as they were making before. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no,
like
and maybe even actually they could potentially set an even higher ceiling as the normal. So yeah, that's and you could just see him sitting there. I'll just project this, but a closed door meeting with French bankers, being like, "Hey guys, like, throw me a little bone, and the fact that I will, my entire agenda is for you. So throw me some symbolic nonsense, and we'll keep muscling through everything that you could possibly want as a banker." So I think Macron eventually going down is a foregone conclusion, and then the question is will the left be in enough shape at that point to actually win and deliver a government, or do we have like a neo-fascist government in the European core? So that's my note. But you're right. Optimistically, he did reverse on some things, and people got to strike and protest.
That's right.
Vanessa AB, I really appreciate your time, contributing editor at Current Affairs. Read her piece, Home for the, say it for me, please.
Lovely talking, for the Gilets jaunes.
Home for the Gilets jaunes days.
Yes.
By Vanessa AB at Current Affairs. Vanessa, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Of
Bye,
course.
Michael.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. Best small team global coverage in the game. All right, it is time.
Like New York, this is a global hub.
New York is a global hub.
Where
New York,
our tentacles have been sprawling out.
It's true.
Yeah.
Some fucking enlightened Parag Khanna shit here. So
I was thinking Yochai Benkler.
Yochai Benkler. Parag Khanna is actually a very nice guy.
Unfamiliar.
He was a big, it was kind of a, much better, but, someone in that sort of like popular books on globalization genre. I think he's in Singapore now. Very nice guy. It is time. Someone shared a meme with me of the scene in Goodfellas where when Jimmy Burke finds out that De Niro's character finds out that Joe Pesci's been whacked, and he's just like bashing the phone at an old phone booth because he's so enraged. And somebody tweeted out like Richard Wolff when he sees that David Griscom is still doing the Economic Minute. So anyways, here's David Griscom with the Economic Minute, a gem system for the Marxist total understanding of your economy and your world.
Get their money.
First thing, get their money. All right, guys, this is a really interesting part of the system, which is expropriate property. I fucking love that.
Evacuate the enemy and make memories and dreams come true. The
Beautiful.
gem system.
The gem system. I love it. All right, what's up? What do we got?
Yeah, so I have to talk about this just because it's big news coming up tomorrow. We're starting to see the end of what I've been calling the era of cheap money. The Federal Reserve is very likely to increase their interest rate tomorrow. We still don't know for sure, but pretty much all factors are leaning toward yes. There's a lot of controversy about it, though, because if you've noticed, there's been a lot of volatility in the stock market and also questions about inflation, which is one of the things that the Federal Reserve is very focused on, is trying to reduce inflation, which is why they one of the major reasons why they increase interest rates. But inflation still remains quite low. It's actually only around 1.8%. Now, of course, what matters to us is, wages are still low, and even though there is low unemployment. So the question really is what is going to happen with this economy once we start seeing higher interest rates? Remember, these interest rates were plunged very low to deal with the economic crisis caused by the greed and excesses of the banks. It was basically trying to fix a liquidity crisis that we were seeing all across the world. So it's one of these things that we're really going to have to start looking at the U.S. economy in a little bit more structural way. Because what we've seen so far is throughout this recovery, business spending has been really focused on IP, which we talked about recently, and has gone every other which direction. Stock buybacks just to inflate and to boost asset prices, and every other which direction than to go to the working class people in this country. And what we're very likely to see is a very serious credit shrinking in the United States because there's going to be a tighter policy, because there's going to be higher interest rates. Meanwhile, while all the people who lost their money on the top 10% basically have got their money back plus more, right? They're better off now than they were before the crisis, right? The rest of us are much worse off with tremendous amounts of debts. Yes, student loan debts, but also household debt, etc. And we're really starting to see something in the U.S. economy which is increasingly tied to the markets and to asset prices, despite the fact that the majority of Americans do not benefit from a system that is increasingly tied to the price of assets and to the markets, right? And the fact that our entire political class is bent on just helping out those people while the rest of us suffer. The fact is that the very complex debt recycling mechanism that was created and really was thriving in the early 2000s is fundamentally broken, and propping it up through the plans that were put in place after the financial crisis really is coming down to be a failure. So we're going to see what happens with the Federal Reserve. They're being watched very carefully. But again, just on the questions of the stock market and to try to figure out if there's going to be enough money for there to be more stock buybacks in the next year. Now, I just really want to talk about this because, we've talked a lot about wage increases, and we've talked a lot about, the unemployment rate and, what it's like for working America. I think we really need to start talking about what they're focused on, which is wealth. That's why we talk about the stock prices. That's why we talk about asset prices, because wealth is what matters, right? And that's where all the power in the society is, and that's why our government is so quick to act to defend the wealthy while the rest of us continue to suffer. The fact is that income is a paltry sum compared to the amount of money that people get from asset extraction. And asset extraction, talking about natural resources, for example, oil extraction, things like that, is incredibly harmful to the air we breathe and the society and our personal future that we're all going to be living in. And that's something that is not democratically controlled. It's something that we can't even talk about. And that's something that's really driving a lot of the inequities across the world. Why are we talking about in every country right now the divergency between the poor and the wealthy, as Joe Biden likes to say, the gaping.
This, I have to say, this is very frustrating to me because I texted Matt 2 minutes ago and I said Biden drop because it would fit so perfectly.
No, but seriously, it's like we really need to start talking about seriously start talking about wealth, and the left needs to be a lot more bold about addressing this problem, talking about serious redistribution, not just through taxes.
Economic democracy is not on the table, you're not going to durably address these challenges.
And I'm not just talking about higher minimum wage or just expansions in the welfare
economic
state.
democracy means, well, you can spell it out, but
No, it's like we really need to start talking about this seriously, because if we have an entire economy where basically a small group of people are able to extract value on the top of it through stocks, right, and through owning assets and through IP and all these other ways that labor is sort of extracted more and more abstractly, of course, and that's why we have these kind of crazy crises. If we don't start talking about why those people are owning and controlling all of that wealth and talking about how we're going to address it and how we're going to distribute that, right, we're going to be continuing to see these kind of crises throughout the next 15, 20 years. And I don't want to be living in that kind of society anymore. We need to be much more bolder, we need to be much stronger, and we need to be much more articulate when it comes to what we want in our future. And it certainly is not going to be in a continuation of society that is very much lopsided to benefit the few people who own property, the few people who own assets, and the few people who benefit from the U.S. stock market.
What about dominance hierarchies?
I don't think he's dominant of anything.
Yeah. Fuck out of here, you crying lobster charlatan son of a bitch. That's exactly right. Economic democracy needs to be at the center of the plan. David Griscom with the gem. All right, guys, this is a very important interview, and it's an honor for us, and it's a very unusual interview for English language media, which is, look, it's a positive reflection on us and the coverage we do and the linkages we're building that we're able to get this interview, and it's also an incredibly damning indictment of CNN, BBC, The Guardian, The New York Times, that these interviews are not regularly taking place, both in the context of the destruction of democracy in Brazil, going back several years now, and of course about to be potentially catastrophically accelerated under the Bolsonaro fascist regime, but also in the political imprisonment of an incredibly successful president, an innocent man, and a person who absolutely, almost certainly would have defeated Bolsonaro had he been allowed to run in a clean, non-corrupt, non-coup environment and taking Brazil and the world in a far better direction. So this is this conversation that I recorded earlier today with Valeska Martins. She's a co-counsel for Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He's, of course, the two-term former president of Brazil, labor leader, someone who helped bring down the military dictatorship in the 1980s, tens of millions brought out of poverty. These new independent foreign policy, these things should be mentioned every single time we talk about Lula because of the calumny of the war against him by these forces. This is a very meaningful interview, and I just request that as you watch and as you listen, please spread stories about what's happening in Brazil, and please ask your representatives to speak out broadly in terms of the crisis, in terms of the assassination of Marielle Franco, and certainly for the immediate, unconditional release and liberation and exoneration of Lula da Silva. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Valeska Martins. She is a co-counsel for President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. She joins us from Brazil. Valeska, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Can you start, I guess we're going to work it backwards and get into the broader questions of President Lula's case, which we've been covering, as well as the broader situation in Brazil on this show. But not in the past couple of weeks, there have been new accusations and new charges that have been unveiled against him, as well as other leaders of PT. Can you, or PT, can you give us a sense of some of the new things that are being leveled against President Lula as this sort of ongoing lawfare process?
Yes. Well, actually, this is something that it's a very complex process in Brazil. We have shown since the start that President Lula, as you already said, is a victim of lawfare, which in its core means that there should be a lot of suspicion regarding his innocence, a lot of attacks in terms of judicial procedures, an asymmetric judicial attack, because they're in order for the population to feel that he's guilty. Therefore, any conviction without any kind of materiality, any kind of evidence, would be accepted by the population. And this is exactly what we have seen for the past weeks. New accusations have surfaced which have no materiality, no evidence, no logic. Even if you repeat the cases, they actually lack any kind of logic, support that would even entitle or give how can I say this? Give reason to begin an investigation. But this again, it all comes to the fact that once you have a political situation in Brazil, they need to shift attention, and then new accusations come up, new procedures come up. It's always this process that repeats itself every time there is a need to change, to shift attention, the population's attention.
What, first of all, define lawfare for us and explain specifically how lawfare has been used for several years now to target President Lula.
Well, I'll give you a background. It started with false media reports back in 2014. We can count up to 500 magazine covers somehow reporting an action that would be illegal with no evidence. We started filing lawsuits against such falsehoods and such false reports by the mainstream media in Brazil. And these stories actually became legal procedures, became criminal investigations, but it all was actually gave cause to these. They actually violated the presumption of innocence by President Lula, creating this person that was demonized by the media, and therefore could be investigated by anything that actually the population would not be able to process anymore, what the evidences were, what the real hard evidences were of corruption or of money laundering in his case. Then he was illegally, he was taken to an airport in March of 2016, where he had to give a deposition basically on his entire 2 mandates, with no evidence whatsoever that would entitle them to investigate him. And from there on, it became a matter of investigations and judicial proceedings with absolutely frivolous, that every day would come out in the media. So we identified the phenomenon, which is lawfare, which is the junction of law and warfare, creating a lawfare, which is the massive attack, asymmetric attack by the state against an individual, frivolous attack in order to delegitimize and to demonize a citizen. It is a partnership with the mainstream media in order for the presumption of guilt to be created, and therefore those agents politically persecuting a citizen may arrest or convict the citizen without any evidence of guilt. And this is basically what happened to Lula. But this is, I would say that from every case that we have studied, this is the biggest lawfare case, we would say actually, in history. I don't think we can I don't think we can recognize in history or in the world such a massive attack by the media and by the judiciary, parts of the judiciary in Brazil, as we have seen in Lula's case. No evidence of his guilt has been found, and still he's in jail.
So basically, you're describing a process, if I understand you correctly, of essentially rumor mills starting in media outlets that, starting in 2014, took a very sharp and aggressive turn against the Workers' Party, against the Dilma Rousseff government. And then it was sort of a kind of rumor mill about corruption with the president, which would then get laundered and shifted into actual criminal investigations. If I understand you correctly, what I would like to know is, could you explain to, and this is big, but I think these are the things that I really want my audience and people in the United States to understand as well as possible. What was the validity and the real aspects, the genuine aspects of the Lava Jato investigation versus what has been weaponized as a political process to attack the Workers' Party more broadly and President Lula specifically? And maybe as you answer, you could, start getting into some of the specifics, because they are. I've read interviews with you and I've looked at this a little bit. They really, the lack of evidence in the charges against him really are shocking. So maybe you could elaborate that as well.
Yes. So the Lava Jato operation, the car wash in English operation, started in 2014. It started as a anti-corruption operation in Brazil, which identified focus of corruption within the Petrobras company, which is the oil state-owned company, one of the largest in its industry in the world. So they had identified a focus of corruption, and from there on, we believe that after identifying certain acts of corruption, it became a politicized operation, driven in order to demonize former President Lula in a sort of an experiment in order to wipe out actually everything that he had done in government. And all of his actions while he was president were actually, and on the contrary, he empowered the federal police. He empowered the prosecutor's office. He created controlling agencies to oversee acts of corruption of its state-owned companies. It was during the Workers' Party mandates, presidencies, that all of the legislation fighting corruption, all of these legislations were implemented. The car wash operation started by leaking out rumors that supposedly he would be involved here and there, here and there. So it became a daily news coverage that Lula might be implicated here and there in some manner, up to a point that it became absolutely acceptable by society, by Brazilians, that Lula would be somehow implicated because they had no idea where he would be implicated. And then they started investigating him. They investigated him thoroughly for 3 years. Not only him, but his wife, his children's houses. Even our lawyers, were illegally wiretapped. There was an interception of our main landline here in the office, so that they could map out and strategize all of the defense of President Lula. And we even saw a chart that's in the files in the federal police that had literally a chart with an organogram with all of the defense, all of the actions that the defense team would take if there was a violation here and there. I don't think we can identify in other places, in civilized countries, such a violation of human rights in terms of one's defense as we have seen here in Brazil in this case.
And what
they analyzed, they scrutinized him and couldn't find one shred of evidence that he had a dime here in Switzerland, or he had anything that wasn't accounted for, that he hadn't paid taxes for, or he had a legal origin for. And they created this, I don't know if you ever saw this big PowerPoint on propinocracy, which basically said that since Lula was the president and there was an act of corruption, or there was corruption within the Petrobras company, that he would be blamed for it. Sort of what you would say as the commander theory.
The buck stops here type of thing.
Yeah. Yes. So, and then from there on, they blamed him for having an apartment, a beach apartment, which was never his. He never wanted it. Actually, he hated it. And he went there one day in order to find out whether he would purchase it, and declined it right away. Mm-hmm. If you look at the details, it's I'm sure shocking for anybody to try and understand how a complex democracy as Brazil would allow such an injustice. And all the other charges are in the same manner. So since he was president and he visited a real estate property, that real estate property must have somehow been promised to him. So it is an attack on and a misuse of the legislation. Actually, it's ruining and corroding the rule of law in Brazil.
How did Sergio Moro, who was the prosecutor who, first of all, explain to people how in the Brazilian system he could be both the prosecutor and the judge of Lula, and secondly, I mean, just I guess to just really be clear, I mean, the actual thing that they put him in jail for, which you just explained, which is this condo that he never occupied and they never established any paper trail connecting him to it, was not a car wash connected story anyway. And so barring that establishment of material evidence, he was put in jail for 12 years as the leading presidential candidate for literally, the phrase, if I understand it correctly, is indeterminate acts.
Yes.
What does that mean? I mean, what is Judge Sergio Moro? How does he get to be prosecutor and judge? And what is indeterminate acts?
Well, in Brazil, there is a failure of the legislation. I think it's one of the few countries in the world that still have this inquisitorial system, which means that the judge in charge of the investigation, in charge of allowing search and seizures, interception of telephones, all of these measures of investigation, that he then, by accepting a criminal procedure against an individual that he had investigated, that he then becomes the judge solely, without a jury, to judge, to preside the judgment of a person. And this is exactly what happened. And this is a major breach of international criminal procedure that only by analyzing the legislation would lead into a lack of impartiality by the judge. But this is a procedure that was the car wash operation operated in such a partnership with the mainstream media in Brazil that Judge Sergio Moro was actually placed as the hero, the anti-corruption hero that nobody could contest, nobody could defy, because then they would be blamed by the mainstream media of actually being in favor of corruption. Judge Sergio Moro was portrayed in parades in Brazil, in major manifestations against corruption, in balloons as the hero that would save Brazil. And he accepted that role. And the fact that he allowed such a fragile procedure against Lula, that he accepted the jurisdiction of the case, and all of his actions would indicate that he had a political agenda, and that he meant by all means to convict Lula no matter what the evidence said. And this is why in 2016 we took this case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in July of 2016. And you can note that there wasn't even a criminal charge, actual criminal charge against President Lula. But we go there and we say, this is a man, this is a procedure that will convict him no matter what, right, in spite of all of the evidence, in spite of all of the evidence of innocence. Because, as we explained in that procedure before the United Nations, Judge Sergio Moro always had a political agenda. And I'm sure this has been proven by his acceptance of a political job now, which is the Minister of Justice.
In the incoming extreme far-right and globally dangerous Bolsonaro government. A couple more things I want to touch on, including also, in fact, because you were able to interact with President Lula regularly, and we support him and are concerned about him and the broader dynamics of this on this show in our community. But a couple of other things just to get to before that. Was there a U.S. role in this? And specifically, I'm talking about the coordination between the U.S. Justice Department and the car wash investigation, and also Petrobras, because it seems to me that Petrobras was a very important national company for Brazil, which was actually sort of used very creatively and I mean that in a good, not euphemistic way. Like it was a company that was used essentially to actually generate public value for all Brazilians in the Workers' Party government, and was a sort of like a large multinational that actually cycled a significant amount of money back into social programs in Brazil. And even if there was real corruption found there, it seems kind of amazing that you would let a company, and I know you've talked about this with Brian Mayer, so big totally fail in a kind of too big to fail sense, except unlike Wall Street banks that seem to have more of a public benefit. And I'm wondering if you could maybe connect that with a potential U.S. Department of Justice role in the car wash investigation and the policy around Petrobras and nationalization and those types of issues.
Well, in 2017, the Department of Justice participated in a seminar with the former general prosecutor here in Brazil, where they announced that they had helped to help the investigation of the car wash operation and helped in the conviction of President Lula. There are about 4 speeches by former prosecutors and still prosecutors of the DOJ, the Department of Justice of the United States, explaining how they have helped with investigations, how they have helped as what they would say is the biggest anti-corruption procedure. But what we have seen, and I will give you a late example, is that a very current example is the Embraer, which somehow got involved in the car wash operation, and the DOJ entered into a plea bargain with Embraer.
Is that a construction company?
It's an aviation company.
Aviation company, okay. Embraer.
Yeah, it's a manufacturer, okay. Yeah.
Got it.
So they got involved in the car wash operation. They had to enter into a plea bargain agreement with the Department of Justice. And let's put it in a permanent monitoring situation where the Department of Justice would constantly monitor Embraer, and it resulted in Boeing purchasing the company, which is one of the most strategic companies of the country. That has just happened, so it's a result of the car wash operation as well. They have been monitoring Petrobras since 2014, and it has just come out Petrobras has just announced that they have also entered into an agreement with the Department of Justice. We have, I would say, the car wash operation was the entrance of the United States in Latin America. It allowed, through the companies and through the plea bargain agreements, it allowed the United States to start investigations in other Latin American countries, in other countries of the world, for geopolitical issues and for geopolitical purposes. And it created a series of frivolous lawsuits against certain former leaders of the progressive parties of Latin America. Once you take and analyze all of the methodology of the car wash operation, you see that there has been cooperation, hand-in-hand cooperation of the Department of Justice of the United States for political purposes.
For political purposes, and with an interest in the strategic assets of countries like Brazil, and also to reverse the gains of what they call the pink tide governments, which were governing in the early 2000s, and of which obviously Lula was a major leader of, and mostly center-left governments, frankly, delivering some measure of social and environmental progress.
We were talking actually about oil
Yes.
Huge amount of oil. We're talking about engineering. We're talking about defense. We're talking about plane aircraft manufacturing, which actually Embraer will be receiving technology from other European companies. So this is a major operation which has a lot of commercial and geopolitical upside for the United States.
Absolutely. Before we get to President Lula, I mean, the only other thing to bring into the table is, okay, we have this lawfare case. The United Nations has supported you in your efforts in terms of questioning the validity of the investigation, saying that President Lula should be able to run for president. There's a lot of international support, particularly in Europe, but also Africa, for President Lula. The Brazilian judiciary has been mostly, obviously highly unfavorable, including going so far as to suppress his ability to even give an interview during the election campaign, which was pretty extraordinary. But there was also an acknowledgement recently from, I believe, a Brazilian general that they sort of gave an indirect threat during the campaign to the judiciary to not allow Lula to run and to not release him. And so as you deal with the judiciary, do you see, what's the role of the military in all of this beyond the judicial process?
Well, on the day that Lula's preventive habeas corpus was judged in the Supreme Court back in April of 2018, the commander of the Army of Brazil tweeted saying that it was unacceptable to have Lula. I'm trying to remember the exact phrase because he actually tweeted again, but it was somehow saying that the military would not accept Lula's not in jailing the judiciary, not in jailing Lula or imprisoning Lula, which created a threat against the Supreme Court, which was judging Lula's habeas corpus on that day, and it created a pressure, an intimidation on the judiciary, which led to Lula's arrest, even though his arrest is contrary to the Constitution of Brazil and is contrary to the understanding of the Supreme Court. So the media and the military, they work together in a manner as to try to influence the judiciary's decision up to a point that we believe that Lula will have no justice in Brazil unless there is a serious awakening and people understand that in order to politically persecute Lula, we are eroding and we are actually going against the Constitution and in the end creating a state of exception in Brazil.
Last couple of minutes. First, I want to ask, you are able to see President Lula regularly. He still releases letters. He's still obviously a very important figure in Brazil and internationally. How is he? How's he doing? He's political prisoner for 8 months. What's the sort of state of him? And also I'm assuming he still probably has a sort of analysis of the situation in Brazil.
He has always been a very strong person, of course, and he's always known that he had the courage to denounce it, whereas other people do not have the courage to speak out about what happens in these procedures. He's very sound. He's very strong, even though he's lost a lot of weight. He understands as I would say with a clarity that we can see, of course, in a small group of people. He understands the situation, the scenario in Brazil. He understands the international scenario, but it's a man who suffered so much injustice You have to remember that he was demonized. He lost his wife. His wife deceased. Is deceased. She passed away in January of last year in a very tragic situation because she had an aneurysm erupting when she was faced with her son's subpoena in a criminal charge. They've blocked. They've frozen all of his efforts. They are trying to persecute his family, his collaborators, even his lawyers. He's a very he's very strong. He knows what's happening, but he's very, I would put it as he's mad.
Of course. Injustice.
It's creating as any victim of such a huge and massive injustice would be. He wants justice to be served. He wants the people. Once he told me that he would not forgive the car wash operation for creating a scenario where everybody could call him a thief, because his biography and his life, his public life as a public servant, and serving the people is the only thing that matters in his life. And he will fight actually until the end of his life to prove that he's innocent, that he's a victim of a political persecution, a vicious political persecution.
Yeah, I know. I mean, what explains? I mean, we talk about so many things on this show. Many parts of the world, and obviously inside the United States. He was this, and I understand that. I mean, the U.S. interference makes sense, but why is there such ferocious hatred against such a conciliatory figure?
Yes, I think one of the. I remember when he was here before he was arrested, and actually in the room that I'm speaking in now, and he was just letting it out, and he said, "Why? Why?" This is his question. He said, "I mean, if they wanted to ruin me, they could at least just asked." Do you? I mean, I've never actually. I've always acted legally, such in a conciliatory manner. He thought he could reunite and reconciliate the elite of Brazil and the poor people of Brazil, and as a peace pact,
right?
In a social peace pact, and he strongly believed in that. But I think there are interests that, commercial interests that, political interests that have played, have taken a higher toll and have, prevailed. And he understands that. And he's absolutely certain. And I spoke to him this week, and he was telling me that he's absolutely 100% sure that it all started because of the oil company. And because of the pre-sal, which is a technology that was developed by Petrobras in order to identify deep waters, oil fields, that was exclusive Petrobras technology. And he's convinced that was the reason that this whole operation and this whole chaos in Brazil started. He just told me this week.
Two more things before we let you go, and we hope that you will be on again, because we'll definitely continue working on this. But first, I mean, what can we do to be helpful?
I think people have to understand what's happening in his procedure, and understand that after all of these years, there was even no shred of evidence came up that he was ever corrupt. So, denounce the methodology and constantly talk about what's happening in Brazil and what's happening to Lula, because he is a symbol,
yes.
I would say symbol of injustice and what might happen when countries deviate from the rule of law. So I would say that Brazil and Lula's case should be watched and studied as a glimpse of a future of a nation that does not understand how strong the institutions are, the rule of law, and first of all, do not understand or care for human rights. So I think this is what he would like, and people to understand that not only did he not have a fair trial and was convicted for undetermined acts because nobody could find an act of corruption, and this is such an alien concept for any legal diploma, but also that he's innocent. He's absolutely innocent, and he wants people to understand that because it's his biography, and he always knew, and he repeats this over and over. He said, I knew that once I came into power, I could not get it wrong. I could not make a mistake.
Right.
So I knew this because I knew that the repercussions that would have on the progressive areas, progressive field all over the world. So I couldn't make a mistake, and I didn't. So he wants people to understand that.
Okay, finally, just two brief requests. One, if time ever permits, when next time you see him, send him the best from us. We're certainly talking about this a lot and reaching out to as many people as possible about it. So there is some solidarity and support here in Brooklyn. And then, secondly, my Portuguese is non-existent. So when you say LulaLivre, is that right or no?
Yes, LulaLivre.
Oh,
yes.
I got it. All right.
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
Spot on.
I thought it wasn't. I thought it was off. Okay, LulaLivre. Well,
yeah.
Valeska Martins, I really appreciate your time. She's a co-counsel for President Lula da Silva. I hope, obviously, I wish you all luck, all safety. And I hope that you can join us again sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. That interview obviously meant a lot to me. And we spoke a little bit off air. And something you'll get when you talk to basically anybody outside of the United States, but particularly in the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, or Africa, parts of South Asia in particular, but some parts of North Asia, which is like, please do what you can to stop the hegemonic project of your country. So this fits, obviously, a global pattern and a global effort of true solidarity, democracy, and dignity. And look, I mean, Lula is objectively the most successful leader we've had of this century so far, and has, beyond justified himself on his own merits, and now is a political prisoner as part of something that exemplifies a much more dangerous, horrific situation. So please speak on it. And look, Bernie Sanders has spoken on this a bit, Barbara Lee, Keith Ellison, Jim McGovern, other people that are good. Insane that AOC hasn't yet. Insane Rashida Tlaib hasn't yet. They're great. They're excellent. There's tons of things to do. Of course, Green New Deal, Amazon, 100%. Yemen, certainly. Middle East, Syria, we know this. But this is the most important political prisoner in our world today. I would certainly hope that, during a time, like if you were around and had a platform during Mandela, one should use it, and certainly people wielding power should as well. And the Workers' Party is certainly of is absolutely of a solidarity with anybody in any kind of like labor-oriented, social democratic, and I emphasize democratic project. Thursday, we're doing another live TMBS because next week we're off. Big Waz crew is in studio.
It's been so long.
It's been so long.
It used to be you took it for granted you get to see Waz, like when we doing Two Dope Boys.
It was a bummer, man. I miss Waz. He's moving to LA.
Now I see all his Instagrams.
I know. And I get all
him
wistful.
Doing LA bullshit.
LA
sort of day parties with NBA players.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're reading about fascism.
I know.
In gloomy
I'm just
New
like,
York.
oh my God, fascist. There's a Hungarian connection to this. Wonder what Waz is up to. It's like, all right,
he's
people.
watching LeBron highlights.
Yeah. That's my man Kawhi.
Yeah, like a Kawhi.
Yeah, right. Thanks. The beef between Drake and good music is complicated, man. It's like when we when we record Woke Bros, you could hear it. It's like, hey, Mike, what's going on? Oh, well, fuck. It's like, LA, it's nice. My lucky woke bro. All right, he's in studio on Thursday. It's going to be an incredible show. Not sure how many elicits we will have for members, but at least 2. Samuel Moyne on the problem with human rights. Jean Bajlan and I on the politically imprisoned Kurdish leadership. Potentially one more. Thanks so much, everybody. Last show of the year. Honored. Appreciate all of you. See us at the live show. Become a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks to Matt, David, and David. Thanks to Forrest. Thanks to everybody, the crew, our mentors. There's a lot of incredible people, including, of course, all of you who make this possible. All right. Thanks. See you in the postgame.